Since I already read the scripture of John 16:19 through 31, we'll just go on into the story here. When Jesus would teach, his favorite method was telling stories. It's interesting how powerful this method really is. There's power in a story. The greatest tool available to each of us as we converse with those around us about our faith is not how much scripture we have memorized or how many questions we might have answers for in apologetics. But the most powerful tool that we have is the story of our lives and our faith within our lives. There's something powerful about a story. We can always tell our story. And for most of us, we love to listen to those stories. To tell others where we once were and where we are now, and the journey that we had taken, and what we have learned along the way can be extremely interesting. Even if we think that we have the most boring life ever, there's something we can learn by simply listening to your journey of faith. And the more that we tell that story, the more we remember and the more interesting it becomes. Jesus was one of the greatest storytellers. But he told a different type of story. There are many different types of stories. There are true stories which contain facts and at times personal narratives to enlighten those who are hearing it as to what might have been going on in the minds of those involved. Another story we often encounter is a story that is fictional. These stories can come in many forms: a myth, a legend, a novel, and many others. Often in our culture, we view that these fictional stories are less than authentic, or they're not as real. We hear the word myth, and immediately we think that it's fiction and nothing good can be gained from it, more than entertainment. But that's not exactly true. Jesus often taught using a similar method. A parable is a mythic form of storytelling. It's a mythic, and because a myth is a story that contains wisdom while still being entertaining. I will be honest. I have learned more about history by reading and listening to fictional accounts than reading actual history books. Because the story grabs hold of something inside of me and it urges me to look deeper into what's going on in that story. And of course, that's largely dependent on the storyteller. Because I have read many books that try to convince people of ideas that aren't based on any reality at all. If you notice, there is a show on TV called Ancient Aliens. Most of that's just fiction. But there are also stories that enlighten our minds a little more and introduce us to actual history. Jesus, as I said before, was a masterful storyteller. Very few of the stories that Jesus taught could be directly linked to an actual event. But each of the stories convey a wisdom that can reveal divine truth to those that listen. Today's story, or parable, is one of the most unique stories that Jesus told. The reason I say that it's unique is because it's one of the only ones that actually contains a name to one of the characters. And that man's name was Lazarus. I might be wrong, but this might be the only parable where a character has a name. This has led some people to believe that this parable might be connected to an actual real event, and it's not just a fictional story. I personally do not necessarily have any opinion one way or the other on that opinion or that idea. But for most of the people that want to say that it is an actual event, they tend to take that route because they want people to believe in a physical fiery hell. I don't want to speak a great deal about hell because, quite frankly, I hope none of you go there because it's not a very nice place. But I do want to mention a few things. Over the course of Hebrew history, the concept of hell evolved. Early, the ideas were simply that you go into a pit where your spirit remains separated from all life. As the Hebrew people interacted with different cultures and their concepts of hell, the Hebrew understanding of hell also changed. And the idea of a fiery wrath of God became a greater part of that story. These concepts came from many places, and one of those places is that place where they burnt human sacrifices. And the idea was that if you participate in that, then you're going to actually live that life. But the concept that we often hear mentioned in the New Testament is a concept of hell that was brought by the people returning from exile. The question that is there, is hell really as it is described? And we really don't know. Because the stories that were told might be embellished a little bit. Because there's ideas that come from other cultures. But there's one theme that remains the same throughout every single description. It is a life after death. There is a place of blessing and consolation, and there's also a place where those that do not believe will be left separated in some way. And there is no rest or comfort in that place. Jesus does speak of the existence that extends beyond the veil of life. And I do believe that we can trust Jesus. The story that he told today begins introducing a rich man clothed in purple. I've always found it interesting that Jesus speaks of the colors of his garment. To have a garment in ancient times that was dyed was a luxury. Ancient methods of dyeing clothing was more difficult than it is today. Today we can go into the store and we can find pretty much any color of dye that we could imagine. And it's usually sold in the same aisle as the laundry soap, so you can wash your clothes from the dye as soon as you mix it up, because if you're like me, you always make a mess. We can get the dye in almost every color, and we can revitalize the clothes that we wear, or we can make psychedelic designs on plain white t-shirts. Dyeing in ancient eras took a bit more skill. They had to go out and they had to find the right ingredients. They had to know just how to prepare those ingredients so that they could leave that pigment in the fabric. And they had to know how to ensure that color would stay in the fabric and not wash out. The materials could be found almost anywhere. The soils in the area could offer a pigment, or the plants in the area would be the source of the pigment that they desired. And they would boil some of these ingredients, and with others they would mix in with vinegar or even urine to achieve that desired combination.